So we talked about wages, salaries, and taxable income. Now we have to discuss business income. So business income differs because taxpayers are self-employed. If they carry on an unincorporated trade or business as a sole proprietor or independent contractor, these taxpayers may not have income statements for their business income and expenses. The information to prepare to their tax return comes from their records. So, sounds confusing, right? It's a little scarier in real life. So, for contractors, can anybody think of a contractor just off the top of their head? You in the corner?
My dad is contracting right now.
What does he do for contracting?
Right now he's with Republic Services doing revenue stuff, revenue management stuff.
Okay, he does some kind of engineering or something like that?
Mostly like math.
Oh, okay.
I'm not too sure of the details.
What about you? A more common one.
Think of it as anybody in a specialized trade that's brought into a company without being officially employed by that company.
Absolutely, that's a perfect definition. Anybody that's brought into a company that's not technically employed for a specialized trade. Can anybody think of a specialized trade that would be considered as a contractor?
Plumbing.
Plumbing, that's a great one.
Like janitors.
Janitors.
A real estate agent.
Real estate, I like that. You had your hand up? Construction worker, that's a very common one. Gardening, yeah. We have a lot of those.
Inspector.
Inspectors, cool. You guys are getting it.
Rideshare drivers, are they contract?
Yeah, rideshare drivers, that's another common one that we see. That's a very, very common one that we see. So those employees are given this form that's reported to the IRS, and that is called the 1099 NEC. And when you see this form, don't be scared, okay? That's what we're here to do, is to assist you and to help you. There will be a scenario question with the 1099 NEC. We will walk through and show you guys how to do those things, I believe. But for your eyes, this is what it looks like. So this is how it differs. So this is what a 1099 looks like, and this is what a W-2 looks like. This is a paid employee. This is a contractor. And this is also a 1099K. So some 1099 NECs will receive a 1099K, and it just shows the breakdown of how much they were paid throughout the year. Same form, just different method. So this is something that we created a couple years back. So because 1099 NECs aren't W-2 workers, like it said earlier, they don't calculate their expenses, but their expenses can help reduce their tax liability at the end of each year. So what we had to do is create a form that these taxpayers will fill out to show what expenses that they had throughout the year. So if we think like a plumber, for instance, what are some expenses that you think a plumber would incur throughout the year? Materials, what kind?
Piping and tools.
Cool. Maybe some steel toe boots? Maybe a belt, maybe not. Okay. What about a construction worker? What kind of expenses do you think they would incur throughout the year?
Also material.
Maybe tools, maybe a hard hat. What about an Uber driver? Mileage. Maybe a container to keep their food warm.
Does like food they buy when they're working count as an expense?
No, ma'am. The question was online that does food bought while on the job count, and the answer is no. So when we look at this form, we want to make sure that the expense is relative to the job itself. So it can't be just regular clothes because everybody has to wear clothes, or food because everyone has to eat, unless you're like an advertising agency where you bought your client's lunch for a business meeting or something of that nature, right?
So for the plumber, would like mileage be an expense like going to traveling to clients?
Correct. Yep. So a plumber could technically take mileage. to go to its location. So that's what this breakdown. This sheet breaks down. So every time we see an NEC, the next form that we hand a taxpayer before they even see you guys is this form. And we say, can you go over there and figure out what your expenses were for last year? Most times if they're a returning client, before they leave, I give them a blank one and say, throughout the year, on the back side, I want you to write down every time you made an expense, every time that you went somewhere, every time that it was for the job purpose itself. And that way, when you come next year, you have it ready for me when it's time to do this. Because most times, these individuals, like you said, are making plumbers, what do they make? $100,000 a year or so? Or truck drivers make 120 or so. They're not tracking their expenses because they're going to have to pay. Most times, they're going to have to pay a liability at the end of each year because they didn't pay the Social Security tax and tax throughout the year like a standard W-2 worker does. So this is how we kind of offset some of the liability that they may owe with the expenses that they have because they're right. It's in their right to claim them. So this is what the form looks like. Advertising, commissions and fees, sometimes health insurance premiums, legal professional services if you're a notary. We have office expenses if you have a building, supplies, things of that nature, and car and truck expense as well. And at the bottom, we do miles driven for Ubers and Lyfts. Uber and Lyft do a really good job of giving you that information. They have like a 3-page document that comes with their 1099, and it breaks all of this down for you. It makes it really simple. So, yep, this is just another form for profit and loss. This is what's produced on the Schedule C for the 1040. So this is what we see once we input everything into the system, and this is what's produced. And this is what the finalized copy looks like once we have input all the information onto the 1040. Oh, yeah, it's for the loss, yeah. So we will never do a business at a loss, by the way. Yeah.
That's kind of along the question I had. Is it possible at all to see a taxpayer who is receiving a W-2 but also has like the side business going?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We have all kinds. I've had taxpayers who had 12 W-2s. I think the most I've seen is 16 W-2s. I was like, wow, how do you interview? Because you kill it. And they're like, oh, yeah, I stayed there 2 days and then I left. I was like, wow. But it's not uncommon to have people with more than one W-2, people with more 1090, more than one NEC. Most times you'll see a mixture, especially in this economy. A lot of people do side jobs and side gigs and all kinds of things. Good question. So this is what the form looks like. So business income, how it's in scope for us, because these individuals can get out of scope very quickly. Because if you're operating as a business, the last thing we want to do is take all of our time to assist individuals who are making multi-million-dollar enterprises. Because we are a VITA program, we don't have the time, resources, or capabilities, or even the certification level to assist those individuals. So for the purposes of your certification, these are the guidelines in which we can service an individual who is a contractor. So has less than $35,000 in business expenses. Use the cash method of accounting. Have no inventory at any time during the year. Did not have a net loss for the business. That's a big one. They can't do a business operating at a loss. Have no employees during the year, so they didn't pay anyone to do the services with them. Are not required to file a Form 4562. And do not deduct expenses for business use of a home. The business use of the income for the home is a little bit tricky, and so it gets really complicated very fast. And so for the purposes of our certification level, we want to keep it as simple as possible to make sure that we're targeting the individuals that need our services the most, which are your gardeners and your construction workers, the individuals in the community who really need our services. And if they make more, have more than $35,000 in straight loss, then they're doing relatively well for themselves and should pay an actual accountant to have their services provided. So here are some expenses that we talked about earlier. that are in scope for us, within our range of scope, which is advertising. Remember, you got to be some kind of, it has to be relative to the job itself. So not everyone can just say, oh, I'm a construction worker, but I did advertising. I can take an expense for advertising, because that's not how it works. Advertising, car and truck expense is a very big one. Then we'll go over how to input that into the system. Commission and fees, insurance, other interests, legal and professional services, taxes, licenses, supplies, repairs and maintenance, utilities, and other expenses. We'll go into detail about how to input that into the system to create a Schedule C. So what does that look like in the system? There it is. This is a useless piece of information, but a 1099 MISC used to be a 1099 NEC, but now they're two different things. And it's a little bit easier, so you can see it there. And that's where they're located within the software. And once again, there is the 1099 NEC form. And this is how we started in the system. So once we click on the 1099 NEC form back here, we input it in the software here. So when we create a 1099 NEC, we say this is the income that it was received, and this is where it came from. And then we create a Schedule C form, and this form says, these are the expenses that I incurred from my 1099 NEC. So we'll input the income, and then we'll work the expenses, and the general expenses and the other expenses. And how we find those is because we had them do the worksheets beforehand. Most times we're still working on those, so if they're too complicated, most site managers or system managers would probably take those from you, but they'll allow you to input most of the information. You will do an exercise in your advanced certification for one of these, and so it's good to know. And so this is what it looks like in the Schedule C, and this is where we would input the incomes for the Schedule C, on the Schedule C for the 1099 NEC. And this is where the car and truck expense goes. So the description of the vehicle, it just differs depending on what the make or model of the car is. You would just put it there. We put when it was placed into service, and then we put the amount of business miles and the commuting miles, and as well as others. The testing software or the testing booklet will have a scenario where you will put this in, and you will do this exercise as well as put it into the software. I got to see if you guys do that one today, but we'll see. But that's what it looks like. So we can't stress enough how much good record keeping is needed for this line of work, because most people will think that they're working for an organization and get an NEC as a contractor and not be aware. And so I've had nightmare stories of people who come and they're like, well, I got this NEC, but I didn't have any expenses because the organization paid for everything. And in those situations, they do have to face a very large liability. That means they owe a lot of money to the IRS. And so the best way that they can mitigate some of those losses is if they keep good record keeping. And we stress it very often in our community. Make sure you're keeping track. Make sure you're keeping records. Make sure you have the documents in case you are to be audited. So business income, net income, $400 or more, taxpayers are subject to self-employment tax. And so this is really where that liability comes in. When we look at the 1040 and as a whole, the self-employment tax comes after your taxable income and after your non-refundable credits. That means absolutely nothing to you now, but that means that most credits don't help mitigate the tax liability of self-employment income. And the software will automatically do this for you. You don't have to sit there with a calculator and type all this stuff in. the software will produce the proper tax rate for these things for you. All right, so we have a poll question. Daniel has his own business. He received a Form 1099 NEC for $13,000 for work he completed as an independent contractor. He also received cash payments that totaled $2,500 for other jobs he completed for the different individuals. Must Daniel report the cash payments of $2,500 on his return? Yes or no? Pretty decisive. That's a yes. And this is